Brielle Ashford believed her black husband had married into privilege, so at her family's anniversary dinner, she mocked his thrift store suit, called his consulting work charity, and ordered him to serve wine like hired help. Malcolm Reed endured the laughter, without defending himself. Then a convoy stopped outside the family's $90 million estate. An older black man entered, placed a signed deed on the table, and announced he had purchased the property that morning. But when he called Malcolm his son, Brielle's humiliation turned into terror because the mansion was only the first thing her family was about to lose that night. The Ashford estate sat on hundreds of acres outside Charleston, a property so grand that local newspapers routinely estimated its worth, including the artwork, the private vineyard, and the marble halls at nearly $90 million. Brielle had grown up inside those walls, believing the name Ashford could open any door in the world, and for most of her life it had. She married Malcolm Reed 9 years earlier, a calm and quietly brilliant man who ran a small consulting firm called Reed Strategic Advisory, a business built on saving struggling companies from collapse rather than chasing headlines. He drove an aging sedan, wore simple clothes, and never once mentioned wealth because, unlike his wife, he had never needed to prove anything to anyone. In the early years of their marriage, Brielle loved that about him, the way he treated a janitor and a senator with the exact same respect. But somewhere between her return to the family charitable foundation and her father's growing obsession with appearances, something inside her had quietly curdled. Conrad Ashford, her father, was 64 years old and fiercely proud of a dynasty that, unknown to most of the guests who dined at his table, had been slowly rotting from the inside for years. He told anyone who would listen that his daughter had married beneath her station, a sentiment his wife Lenora echoed with the kind of polished cruelty that never sounded like cruelty at all. Lenora specialized in compliments that cut, telling Malcolm once that he spoke better than she expected, as though his intelligence were a surprising anomaly rather than simply who he was. Grant, Brielle's older brother, and the family's supposed heir apparent, treated Malcolm's modest firm as a running joke, calling it Brielle's personal charity project, in front of guests who laughed along out of obligation, rather than agreement. Malcolm absorbed these comments for years, mostly in silence, because Brielle always begged him afterward to let it go for the sake of family peace. Slowly, without either of them quite noticing the shift, she stopped defending him and started repeating their language instead, until the boundary between her family's contempt and her own had all but disappeared. Months before the anniversary dinner, Malcolm found an envelope stamped by a private bank sitting on the kitchen counter, and before he could read more than a line, Brielle snatched it away, insisting it was only paperwork related to her, a father's taxes. He noticed enough, though, to catch a phrase about default and outstanding obligations, words that did not belong anywhere near a family that spoke constantly of its own permanence. When he asked whether the Ashfords were in financial trouble, Brielle turned defensive almost instantly, telling him a man who ran a company with fewer than 10 employees could not possibly understand the complex financial structures her family operated within. Malcolm said nothing more that day, but the comment settled somewhere deep and permanent, a small crack in a marriage that had already been fracturing for years. Around the same time, an entire wing of the estate quietly closed for what Lenora called renovations. Household staff vanished under the vague label of restructuring, and Conrad began taking phone calls he immediately excused himself to answer in private. Grant pressured Brielle to convince Malcolm to invest in a family real estate venture, and when Malcolm reviewed the numbers and refused, citing inconsistencies, he could not ignore the family treated his caution as an insult rather than the friend, warning it actually was. Douglas Hale, the banker who had quietly financed several of the Ashford family's ventures over the years, had begun asking pointed questions about missing collateral during private lunches with Conrad. Questions Conrad always deflected, with talk of upcoming windfalls that never seemed to materialize. Brielle overheard fragments of these conversations, but chose not to press further, telling herself that whatever troubled her father was simply the ordinary friction of running a large estate. She busied herself instead with the details of the upcoming anniversary celebration, insisting the event needed to be the most memorable the family had ever hosted, as though enough candlelight and imported champagne could erase whatever cracks were spreading beneath the surface. Malcolm watched his wife pour herself into party planning, with an intensity she rarely showed toward anything else in their life together. And he wondered privately whether she sensed the danger even as she refused to acknowledge it aloud. The invitation to the Foundation's anniversary gala arrived on ivory cardstock, and Brielle handed Malcolm his instructions, along with it cold and precise as a memo. He would wear the suit she selected, he would not discuss his work, and above all, he would not embarrass her in front of her family. Malcolm remembered almost involuntarily the night they met at a conference for struggling small businesses years earlier, when Brielle's car broke down and she was left stranded and unrecognized, before he simply stopped to help a stranger without knowing she came from money at all. She had been drawn to him precisely because he treated everyone the same, a quality her parents had spent years trying to train out of their daughter through quiet, relentless disapproval. Malcolm tried once more before the party to speak honestly, with his wife telling her he would not keep showing up to places where he was treated as an afterthought if she refused to stand beside him. Brielle called him oversensitive, insisted her family was only teasing, and reminded him he should feel grateful to be included in gatherings most people could only dream of attending. He asked her directly whether she was ashamed of him, and for a long moment Brielle said nothing at all, choosing instead to straighten his tie and tell him not to ruin the evening. As they prepared to leave, an unfamiliar number lit up Malcolm's phone, and on the other end was a composed, precise voice belonging to a woman named Naomi Brooks, lead counsel for a company called Reed Meridian Capital. She explained that a significant acquisition involving the Ashford family was nearing completion and asked whether Malcolm wanted his father to delay the closing. Malcolm was stunned to learn his father was involved in any transaction touching Brielle's family at all, though he refused to ask for details, insisting that Solomon Reed had to make his business decisions on merit, not on the state of his son's marriage. Naomi mentioned that Solomon wanted to see him that same night, a request Malcolm quietly declined to share with Brielle, still hoping this gala might become the moment his wife finally chose him over her family's approval. When their car pulled toward the estate's gates, Brielle glanced at Malcolm's worn sedan and told him to park it behind the staff quarters so none of the guests would see it, and Malcolm obeyed, though something behind his eyes had already begun to change. Inside the mansion, glittered with crystal chandeliers, imported flowers and bottles of vintage wine, older than most of the guests circulating the ballroom, more than 100 bankers, investors, and local politicians moving beneath lights that cost more than most families earned in a year. Conrad stood at the center of it all, declaring to the crowd that the Ashford Foundation was entering the strongest era in its history, even as the party itself had been financed by the very last of the family's short-term credit. Grant pulled Brielle aside and confessed quietly and urgently that the family needed $12 million within 3 days, or risk losing control of the estate entirely, and he wanted Malcolm's firm to guarantee the loan. Brielle knew perfectly well that Malcolm's company held nowhere near that kind of capital, but Grant remained convinced that Malcolm's wealthy clients could somehow be persuaded to bail them out. Brielle approached her husband and asked him to introduce her father to an investment fund, and Malcolm refused, outright explaining he had never been shown the actual books and warning that co-signing on an opaque loan could expose them both to serious legal liability. She accused him in a low and furious voice of trying to humiliate her family by even questioning their honor, as though a reasonable financial question were itself an act of betrayal. Inside the dining hall, Lenora had arranged the seating so that Malcolm sat at the far end of the table, isolated from his wife, whose seat beside her had instead been reserved for a wealthy banker named Douglas Hale. When Malcolm rose to move his chair closer, Brielle stopped him, insisting the seating followed professional standing and should not be disrupted by personal sentiment. Grant used him as entertainment for the rest of the evening, mocking his ordinary watch, asking loudly whether his small company earned enough to cover gas money, and jokingly offering him a position maintaining the estate's grounds. The whole table laughed, and Malcolm, still composed, said nothing, though his silence only seemed to embolden Grant further. Waitstaff moved silently among the tables, refilling glasses. No one had asked them to refill while a string quartet played somewhere near the marble staircase, the music blending with polite laughter that never quite reached anyone's Eyes. Conrad worked the room like a man selling shares in a company already sinking, shaking hands, promising investment opportunities, and steering every conversation away from numbers and toward nostalgia about the Ashford name. Lenora drifted from guest to guest, offering compliments sharpened into quiet insults, telling one woman her dress was brave for her age, telling another that her husband's new position must be such a relief after his earlier setbacks. Malcolm recognized the pattern immediately. The same cruelty Brielle had absorbed over years of sitting at her mother's side, learning to wound people while smiling the entire time. Across the room, Malcolm noticed a bank representative who never joined the celebration quietly, handing Conrad a folder before disappearing without a word. And something about the exchange told Malcolm exactly what it might contain. He asked Brielle one final time whether she truly understood the state of her family's finances, and she snapped back that he was simply jealous of everything her family had built and he would never possess. Moments later, Conrad announced to the entire ballroom that Grant would be leading a $200 million resort development, a project Malcolm recognized instantly as resting on collateral that had already defaulted. He tried quietly to warn his wife, but Brielle told him to be silent before he embarrassed her further in front of the very people whose approval she still desperately craved. A server accidentally spilled wine near Lenora, who erupted with fury, loud enough to turn heads. And Brielle, eager to redirect the tension, turned to her husband and told him to help clean it up, since it was, in her words, the least he could do. To be useful. Malcolm did not move at first. He asked her calmly and clearly whether she actually wanted him to clean tables like hired staff in front of everyone she knew. Several guests had already turned to watch, and rather than retreat, Brielle pressed forward, determined to prove in front of her family that she still controlled her husband completely. She raised her voice just enough for the whole table to hear, telling him that if he truly wanted to belong to this family, he could start by understanding exactly where he was useful. Grant burst out laughing. Lenora smiled with quiet satisfaction, and Conrad said nothing at all to stop it, content to let his daughter finish what she had started. A few of the guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing something ugly unfolding, but none dared speak up in a room, built entirely on the fear of offending the Ashford name. Malcolm asked her once more, his voice steady, despite everything, whether he was her husband or simply a source of amusement for her family's entertainment. Brielle told him he was overreacting, then mocked the suit he wore, calling it something bought from a discount rack, and dismissed his consulting firm as a charity project for companies nobody else wanted to save. Grant added that Malcolm could always take a job serving drinks at the estate if his little business ever finally collapsed, and the family erupted into laughter, once again loud enough to echo across the marble floor. Brielle saw the pain flicker across her husband's face, and instead of stopping, pushed further still, declaring that he had entered the Ashford family with no wealth, no connections, and no reputation of his own, and that he ought to feel grateful simply to exist inside her world. Malcolm slid the wedding ring from his finger but did not yet set it down. He asked her with a calm that unsettled the room far more than any shouted accusation could have, who had rescued the Ashford Foundation from a devastating labor lawsuit 2 years earlier, who had restructured the winery's crushing debt, and who had quietly covered Grant's legal expenses when he was under investigation and too proud to ask for help. Conrad cut him off instantly, accusing him of trying to steal credit that was never his to claim. Even though every one of those interventions was true, each one carried out at Brielle's private request and kept secret for her family's sake. Brielle still denied it, insisting any competent advisor could have accomplished the same things, unwilling even now to acknowledge what her husband had sacrificed for people who mocked him at every turn. Malcolm understood in that moment that this was not merely pressure from her family anymore. She had made a choice, again and again, to stand with them instead of him, and he finally set the ring down beside his untouched glass of wine. He told her without raising his voice that he would not continue a marriage where respect only appeared when no one else was watching. Brielle, startled for just a second, quickly reclaimed her composure and told him coldly that he had nowhere better to go. At that exact moment, headlights swept across the estate's long driveway, as 4 black vehicles rolled slowly through the front gates and the private security staff caught off guard. We're told the property already belonged to someone else entirely. Naomi Brooks stepped out of the lead car, first carrying a leather folder, and behind her came a tall, composed older man the room did not yet recognize as Solomon Reed. Malcolm looked up and saw his father for the first time in nearly 2 years, while Brielle, mistaking him for a creditor or bank official, ordered the staff to escort him back outside. Solomon walked past her instruction entirely, his eyes moving instead toward his son, standing alone in the middle of the room, a wedding ring resting abandoned on the table before him. He did not raise his voice or make a scene of his arrival. He simply asked Malcolm quietly enough that only the nearest guests could hear how long he had been enduring treatment like this. The entire ballroom fell into stunned silence, glasses frozen halfway to lips, laughter dying in throats that had been cackling only moments before. Brielle turned to look at her husband, and for the first time that evening, real fear crept into her expression, because the powerful stranger who had just walked into her family's ballroom had called Malcolm his son. Conrad recognized the name the moment it registered, having spent years trying and failing to secure even a brief meeting with the founder of Reed Meridian Capital, a firm that quietly controlled hundreds of businesses, hotels, and premium properties across the country. He could not reconcile the modest, unassuming man who had sat silently at the far end of his table with the son of one of the wealthiest investors in the nation. Grant scoffed, insisting this had to be some kind of elaborate performance, arguing that if Malcolm truly came from such wealth, he would never have driven an old sedan or worked out of a small, unremarkable office. Solomon answered simply that his son had left the family company because he refused to live in his father's shadow, choosing instead to build something entirely his own through nothing but discipline and skill. Naomi placed the folder on the table, and in consecutive months, she explained that the estate, along with the surrounding land, had been used as collateral across 3 separate loans, all of which had recently been purchased and consolidated by Reed Meridian Capital, directly from the original lending bank. The right to seize the property, she noted, had gone into effect that very morning, and Solomon Reed had already completed the purchase of the mansion, the vineyard, the wine collection, and every surrounding structure on the estate. Conrad insisted, his voice cracking with disbelief that a property worth $90 million could not simply be seized over what he dismissed as a minor debt. Naomi corrected him without a trace of hesitation, revealing that the family's total outstanding obligations exceeded $68 million, a figure that did not even include unpaid taxes, penalties, or unmet obligations to their own charitable foundation. Solomon had settled the entire debt and secured legal ownership through a court-approved transaction, and he handed Conrad a copy of the signed deed as proof that the matter was already finished. Brielle turned back to her husband, asking why he had never told her he was the son of Solomon Reed, and Malcolm answered that she had already known everything she needed to know about who he was as a person to decide whether he deserved her respect. A wealthy surname, he told her, should never have been the deciding factor in how she treated the man she married. Brielle tried to explain herself, insisting the pressure from her family had clouded her judgment and that her words that evening did not reflect what she truly felt inside. Malcolm asked her plainly whether she would have apologized at all if his father had never walked through that door, and Brielle found she had no answer to give him. Solomon made clear he had not arrived to purchase respect for his son, explaining that the transaction had been set in motion weeks before he ever learned about the party taking place that night. Having witnessed firsthand how the Ashford family treated Malcolm, however, he saw no reason to extend the temporary residency arrangement his lawyers had originally. Solomon informed the room that the Ashford family had 30 days to vacate the property entirely, and that every event, transaction, and fundraising activity tied to the estate would cease immediately. Grant lunged toward Solomon in fury, but was quickly restrained by security before he could reach him. Solomon did not so much as glance in Grant's direction. He kept his gaze fixed on Brielle, instead telling her that she had not lost the estate because she insulted his son, but because her family had built its entire existence on lies, and that she alone had lost Malcolm because of choices only she had made. Naomi opened a second folder, then informing the stunned room that the loss of the estate was far from the most serious problem the Ashford family would face before the night was over. She explained that Reed Meridian's audit team had uncovered millions of dollars quietly diverted from the Ashford Charitable Foundation into a series of shell companies' funds that had financed lavish parties, private jet leases, luxury, vehicles for grant interest payments on failed developments, and falsified financial reports designed to attract unsuspecting new donors. Conrad denied everything, immediately attempting to blame the family accountant, but every document bore his own electronic signature alongside Grant's. Grant, desperate, accused Malcolm of somehow stealing internal records, though Malcolm calmly explained he had never once accessed the Foundation's systems and that these violations had surfaced entirely through the standard due diligence process during the loan acquisition. Brielle recognized her own signature on several fraudulent press releases and insisted she had merely signed whatever her father placed in front of her without reading the details carefully. Naomi reminded her that ignorance did not erase legal responsibility, no matter how convenient an excuse it might seem in the moment. Malcolm recalled with growing clarity the many times Brielle had asked him to publicly confirm the Foundation's financial statements while quietly refusing to share the underlying figures with him, and he now understood that she had participated in the concealment, even if she had never grasped its full scope. Conrad attempted to offer Solomon a private deal, proposing to hand over a portion of the family company if Reed Meridian agreed to keep the scandal quiet. Solomon refused without hesitation, stating plainly that the donors who had trusted the Foundation with their money deserved to know exactly how it had been spent. Grant, losing all composure, blurted out that Conrad himself had instructed him to find money by any means necessary, prompting Conrad to instantly shift the blame entirely onto his own son. A family that had spent the entire evening presenting a united front now turned savagely against itself in a matter of minutes, each member scrambling to survive at the expense of the others. Lenora rounded on Brielle, accusing her of failing to research Malcolm's family background, sooner insisting that had they known about his father's wealth, they would have treated him entirely differently from the start. The comment revealed with brutal clarity the ugliness underlying her mother's worldview, though Brielle also recognized with a sinking dread how closely she herself had come to becoming exactly the same woman. She turned to Malcolm and begged for his help, suggesting that as Solomon's son, he could surely persuade his father to end the investigation before it went any further. Malcolm refused. He reminded her that for years she had insisted he stay out of her family's affairs entirely, and she could not now use him as a shield simply because their secrets had finally come to light. Solomon watched his son's restraint with a complicated mixture of pride and quiet sorrow, feeling no real satisfaction in the collapse unfolding before him. His disappointment was reserved instead for how long Malcolm had endured this treatment in silence. He told his son later that patience was a fine quality in most circumstances, but when it was extended endlessly to people who continually trampled it, patience eventually curdled into permission. Federal investigators and financial officers soon arrived at the estate's front gate to begin seizing the Foundation's records, transforming what had been an anniversary celebration into an active crime scene by the end of the crime scene. Night. While investigators confiscated computers and files throughout the house, Naomi's team uncovered a string of emails exchanged among Brielle Grant and Conrad from 6 months earlier. A prospective partner had once offered Malcolm's firm a contract to restructure the Ashford family's resort project, a deal that could have earned him more than $4 million and marked the largest achievement of his career. Grant, terrified that Malcolm might uncover the funds being illegally siphoned from the project, pressured Brielle into convincing the partner to withdraw the offer entirely. Brielle had written in her own words that her husband's firm lacked the experience necessary and could pose an unacceptable reputational risk to the deal. Malcolm had never known that his own wife was the reason he lost the single largest contract of his professional life. Brielle tried to explain that she had only wanted to avoid conflict between her husband and her father, believing at the time that other opportunities would eventually come his way. Malcolm found this revelation more devastating than anything said at the dinner table that evening because the public humiliation had lasted only minutes while this quiet betrayal had unfolded in secret over months, undermining years of work he had built with his own hands. He asked her how many more times she had chosen her family over their marriage without his knowledge. Brielle admitted one confession spilling into the next, that she had hidden him from photographs intended for magazine features, asked friends never to mention his profession. In conversation told her parents their marriage was merely a passing act of rebellion, and even considered ending things entirely if he never rose to a higher social standing. Malcolm understood in that painful instant that the woman he had fallen in love with years earlier had quietly disappeared long before that night ever began. He picked the wedding ring back up from the table, but instead of sliding it onto his own finger, he placed it gently into Brielle's palm. He told her he would instruct his attorney to begin separation proceedings first thing the following morning. Brielle panicked, insisting she still loved him, and begging for one more chance to make things right. Malcolm answered that love could not survive in a place where one person was constantly required to shrink themselves just to make the other feel bigger. Solomon did not intervene in his son's decision, choosing instead to simply stand beside him and let Malcolm make the choice entirely on his own terms. Meanwhile, Grant attempted to slip out of the estate through a side entrance, clutching a hard drive loaded with financial records, but Malcolm spotted him crossing toward the garage and immediately alerted Naomi and the waiting investigators. Grant was stopped before he ever reached his car, and the hard drive was found to contain evidence that he had personally diverted more than $11 million into private accounts. Cornered and desperate, Grant turned on his own father, naming Conrad as the true architect of the scheme, in exchange for a chance at leniency. Before Malcolm finally left the estate that night, he turned back one last time to look at Brielle standing alone in the center of an empty ballroom, where only an hour earlier she had ordered him to serve wine like hired help. Now it was Brielle who stood at the edge of losing everything, while the man she had spent the evening humiliating walked calmly toward the door. In the weeks that followed, the Ashford scandal spread across every corner of the local and national press, and donors who had once lined up to support the family's foundation began quietly withdrawing their names. The charitable fund was frozen pending investigation, and Conrad resigned from every leadership position he had ever held. Grant faced formal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and falsifying financial records, while Lenora insisted publicly that her family had simply fallen victim to a hostile takeover, a claim Naomi dismantled by releasing documentation proving the Ashfords had already been insolvent, long before Reed Meridian ever entered the Powlers' picture. Brielle was suspended from her role at the foundation for authorizing misleading public statements, and she moved into a small rented apartment while the investigation continued around her. For the first time in her life, she had no household staff, no private driver, and no family name standing between her and the consequences of her own choices. She wrote to Malcolm several times to apologize, though he did not respond right away, choosing instead to focus his energy on protecting the small firm he had spent years building. News that he had refused to help conceal his own father-in-law's fraud only strengthened his professional reputation, and a wave of new clients began seeking him out. Some wanted to hire him purely because he was the son of Solomon Reed, and Malcolm turned every one of them away, unless they respected his expertise on its own merit. Solomon offered his son a future leadership position at Reed Meridian Capital, but Malcolm did not accept right away, telling his father he wanted to keep growing his own company while slowly rebuilding the trust between them. Solomon admitted, for the first time, that he had once mistaken his son's independence for rejection, and the two men began the slow work of repairing a relationship strained by years of distance. They started meeting for breakfast every other Sunday, a habit neither of them had managed to keep in the years before trading updates about business, and slowly, about things that had nothing to do with business at all. Solomon told his son stories about the early years of Reed Meridian Capital, the deals that failed before the ones that succeeded, and the loneliness of building something enormous with no one at home who understood the weight of it. Malcolm listened more than he spoke, recognizing in his father's account the same instinct toward quiet endurance that had nearly cost him his own sense of worth. Reed's strategic advisory grew steadily in the months that followed, not because of the Reed name attached to it, but because word spread among small business owners that Malcolm refused to abandon a client simply because the numbers looked difficult. He hired 3 additional analysts, moved into a slightly larger office, 2 floors above the old one, and turned away more than once offers from companies who wanted his father's reputation rather than his own judgment. A local business journal ran a short profile on him, noting that he had quietly helped more than 40 regional companies avoid bankruptcy over the past 5 years. A fact that surprised even some of his closest colleagues, since Malcolm had never once mentioned it himself. Eventually, Brielle asked to meet Malcolm somewhere far removed from the estate or any polished office, choosing instead the small coffee shop where they had once gone on their earliest dates together. She arrived without her family's jewelry, without careful makeup, and without any request for him to shield her from the ongoing investigation. Brielle admitted she had turned love into a tool for climbing higher, in the eyes of people who never truly valued her either, and that her family's prejudice no longer excused her, since she had chosen again and again to carry it forward herself. Malcolm accepted her apology, but told her plainly that forgiveness did not mean returning to what they once had. He explained he would not build a future with someone who only recognized his worth after learning how wealthy his father happened to be. Brielle asked whether there was any chance left for them at all, and Malcolm told her the only chance she had left was to become a better person, whether or not he remained a part of her life going forward. After the Ashford family departed the estate for the final time, Solomon asked his son what he wanted to do with the sprawling property, now sitting under Reed Meridian's ownership. Several executives suggested converting it into a luxury hotel or an exclusive private retreat, but Malcolm rejected the idea outright. He argued the estate did not need to remain a monument to wealth and status for people determined to prove their own importance. Instead, he proposed transforming a portion of the grounds into a training and support center for Black entrepreneurs and other business owners who had long been overlooked by traditional financial institutions. The main house would become a conference center, while the surrounding buildings were converted into classrooms, shared workspaces, and consulting offices designed to help small businesses survive their most difficult years. Solomon agreed on the condition that Malcolm lead the initiative himself, and Malcolm accepted, insisting the center operate independently with a transparent oversight board and no family name attached to its title. They named it the Meridian Opportunity Center, a place built not to honor a family legacy, but to correct the kind of exclusion both men understood far too well. Several former staff members from the Ashford estate were invited back with better wages and better treatment, finally recognized as valued members of an organization rather than invisible hired help. When Brielle learned of the project, she voluntarily surrendered the internal records she still possessed to investigators, helping recover a portion of the funds stolen from donors who had trusted her family for years. She also began publicly accepting responsibility for her own role, rather than allowing the blame to fall entirely on her father and brother. Malcolm acknowledged the change in her, but never treated it as a reason to reconsider their marriage. The center's first cohort included a bakery owner facing eviction after a burst pipe destroyed her equipment, a construction contractor whose largest client had gone bankrupt without paying a final invoice, and a young couple trying to keep their family's auto repair shop from being swallowed by a predatory loan they never fully understood when they signed it. Malcolm personally reviewed several of the early cases himself, sitting across the same tables where investors had once discussed hostile takeovers, now walking nervous entrepreneurs through spreadsheets and payment plans with the same patience he had once offered a family who never deserved it. Within a year, the center had already helped dozens of struggling businesses avoid collapse and created hundreds of new jobs throughout the surrounding community. Malcolm's own consulting firm continued to grow steadily, though he kept the same modest office, the same aging car, and the same understated way of living he had always preferred. The only real difference was that he no longer felt any need to explain his choices to anyone who questioned them. Naomi eventually announced that the official opening ceremony for the Meridian Opportunity Center would take place inside the very ballroom where Malcolm had once been publicly humiliated, and Solomon asked his son to deliver the closing remarks himself. The opening ceremony drew business owners, former estate employees, investors, and members of the surrounding community, filling a ballroom that no longer separated guests by wealth or status the way it once had. There were no tables reserved for the elite, and no quiet corners set aside for people considered beneath notice. Malcolm stood in almost the exact spot where Brielle had once ordered him to clean up spilled wine like hired help, and he remembered with startling clarity the sound of the whole room laughing at his expense. He did not share that story to seek revenge or sympathy from the crowd gathered before him. He shared it instead to speak directly to every person who had ever been judged by their appearance, their profession, their race, or the size of their bank account. He told the room plainly that no one should ever need to prove their wealth before earning basic respect, and that anyone who only offered kindness after discovering someone's power had never respected them in the first place. Solomon sat near the front, filled with pride, not because his son stood to inherit a fortune, but because Malcolm had taken a place built on his humiliation and turned it into an opportunity for people who needed one. Near the back of the crowded room, Brielle appeared quietly, no longer welcomed as a member of the family, whose name still hung faintly in the estate's history, but simply as an ordinary guest among many others. After the ceremony ended, she approached Malcolm and handed him signed divorce papers. The final formal step in a marriage that had already ended the night everything came apart. Brielle told him she had once believed losing the estate was the harshest punishment her family could ever face. The true punishment, she said, was realizing she had lost the one person who ever loved her back when she had nothing left to offer him but herself. Malcolm did not mock her or gloat over what had become of her life. He simply thanked her for finally telling him the truth, something that had taken far too long to arrive. She asked whether they might someday become friends again, and Malcolm told her that would depend entirely on who each of them chose to become from that point forward, not on who they used to be. They parted ways calmly, without anger and without bitterness, closing a chapter that had cost them both more than either had ever expected to pay. Conrad ultimately pleaded guilty to fraud and misuse of charitable funds and was sentenced to serve time in federal prison. Grant received an even harsher sentence after prosecutors proved he had attempted to destroy evidence and embezzle funds for his own personal use. Lenora moved into a modest home far smaller than anything she had ever known, losing nearly all the social standing she had spent decades cultivating. Brielle avoided prison thanks to her cooperation with investigators. Though she was required to complete community service and repay a significant portion of the stolen funds over time, Solomon continued leading Reed Meridian Capital while gradually handing more responsibility to a new generation of executives he trusted to carry the company forward. Malcolm kept his own firm and became his father's strategic partner by choice, standing as an equal rather than an employee dependent on his father's name. Long after the guests had gone home that evening, Solomon and Malcolm stood together on the balcony, overlooking the grounds that had once belonged entirely to the Ashford family. Solomon asked his son whether he ever regretted keeping his identity hidden from Brielle for all those years. Malcolm answered simply that if she had needed to know who his father was before she could respect him, then she had never truly known who he was at all. Solomon nodded slowly, understanding exactly what his son meant, and said nothing more. Below them, workers removed the old Ashford estate sign that had hung above the entrance for generations, replacing it with something entirely new, a plain sign bearing no family name at all, carrying only a single line meant for everyone who passed beneath it. Dignity requires no invitation. Malcolm looked out over the room where he had once been turned into a joke for an entire family's amusement, understanding now that the mansion worth $90 million belonged legally to his father. But the true victory had nothing to do with any deed or signature. It lived instead in the quiet certainty that he no longer needed money, family status, or anyone's belated regret to know exactly what he was worth. He turned away from the estate that had once tried to diminish him and walked forward into a future built entirely on his own terms.